Welcome, dear listener. You found your way to Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner of the internet where boring history is never quite so boring, especially when it is told slowly, softly, and just a little too long, just long enough to help your restless thoughts drift away. This is, as always, boring history for sleep, a space where bedtime relaxation meets soft storytelling, where you can lose yourself in a calm, unhurried history documentary. A story told without rush, without urgency, just a gentle rhythm of voices from the past. Tonight, we'll wander into a curious theme, one that sits somewhere between daily life and eccentricity, the strange and unusual hobbies of European monarchs, rulers who spent their days in palaces, draped in velvet and ceremony, yet still found time to pursue private fascinations. Some sought distraction, others obsession, some created beauty, and others, well, they puzzle their subject with pursuits that seem entirely peculiar for a king or queen. This will be a soft-spoken history sleep story, designed for fans of Roman history, archaeology, and calm narration, but it also stretches across the medieval and early modern courts of Europe. If you're listening in bed, dim the lights. Let the glow of your screen soften, and allow the words to move slowly, as steady as the ticking of a clock in a quiet hall. If this sort of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting in knowing that others, perhaps far across oceans and mountains, are lying in their own beds, falling asleep to the same old stories. Tonight's journey will unfold in four distinct paths. We will begin by immersing ourselves in the daily lives of monarchs, imagining their surroundings and routines. We will then turn to a specific story, the biography of a ruler whose strange hobbies shape both their personal life and political image. Next, we will step into the hazy realm of cultural mysteries and archaeology, exploring odd traces of leisure left in artifacts and chronicles. And finally, we will contrast these eccentric royal pursuits with the daily realities of common folk whose hobbies were often more necessity than choice. So, let the candles of imagination be lit. Let the pages of old chronicles open softly before us. The rhythm of the past is slow, steady, and if we are lucky, just a little bit boring, the perfect kind of boring history for sleep. Take a deep breath, sink into the comfort of the present moment, and let us begin. Imagine yourself stepping quietly into a royal palace of Europe sometime in the late Middle Ages. The first thing that strikes you is not the wealth, nor the glittered jewels, but the rhythm of routine. Monarchs, for all their immense power, live in a carefully structured world where every day followed patterns, ceremonial, practical, and often surprisingly ordinary. The morning began not in solitude, but in company. A king, for example, rarely rose without an audience. Servants, attendants, and favorite courtiers stood by to assist with the smallest tasks, pulling open the curtains to let in pale morning light, warming the air with braziers, and even assisting in the process of dressing. Clothes were not merely garments. They were symbols, layers of velvet and linen that marked status, stitched with threads of meaning as well as silk. To put on one's robes was to put on one's role. Breakfast might be light or absent altogether, depending on the custom of the kingdom and the century. In France, kings might break their fast with bread dipped in wine. In Spain, hot chocolate would one day become a royal favorite, carried from a new world. Yet even these simple indulgences were often performed as ritual, witnessed by courtiers eager to observe the sovereign's habits. Imagine sipping from a gilded cup, the liquid warm against the cool stone halls, as a dozen eyes watched quietly, noting every gesture. After these beginnings came the labor of monarchy, councils, petitions, and ceremonies. Monarchs were surrounded not only by advisors, but also by the unending sound of paper being read aloud, the murmur of scribes, the rustle of documents being sealed. Decisions might be made about taxes, wars, or marriages, yet all this occurred in spaces thick with incense, or perhaps scented with the beeswax polish of wooden furniture. But what about free time? This is where our theme begins to take shape. A monarch's days were not endless chains of state business. There were pauses, sometimes brief, sometimes lavishly extended. These were the hours in which hobbies could take root. Some monarchs took to hunting, riding out into forests where the sound of hooves and horns echoed. Others turned inward, preferring libraries, music, or mechanical puzzles. Still others, more eccentric, created collections of curious objects or devoted themselves to pastimes that bewildered their subjects. Daily life, then, was a balance of ceremony and privacy. The palace was at once a stage and a cage. To the outside eye, kings and queens were radiant figures of power. But within the quieter chambers of their lives, they sought, like all humans, moments of distraction, of play, of curiosity. These moments, sometimes fleeting, sometimes obsessive, became their hobbies. And it is in these hobbies that we glimpse their humanity most clearly. Picture a queen bent over embroidery, her fingers working fine threads into cloth while attendants whispered nearby, or a king leaning over a chessboard, eyes narrowed not in matters of war, but in anticipation of a clever move. Imagine a ruler who, after hours of judgment and ceremony, retreats into a small, cluttered chamber filled with strange instruments, maps, clocks, globes, musical devices, an entire private world carved out within grandeur palaces. As we move deeper into their lives, we will see how these hobbies were not mere diversions. They reflected personality, politics, and sometimes obsession. For now, let the image of these monarchs linger, not always in robes of ceremony, but in the quiet interludes of daily life, seeking peace, curiosity, or amusement within the walls of their palaces. Now, let us lean a little closer into the quieter rhythms of courtly leisure. Imagine a long gallery in a royal residence. The windows are tall and narrow, letting in shafts of pale light that fall across stone floors. Servants pass silently, their soft footsteps nearly lost in the vastness of the hall. Beyond the formal duties of kingship, monarchs found themselves drawn to pastimes that offered escape from the weight of governance. Hunting was, of course, the most famous diversion. For medieval and early modern kings, the chase was more than sport. It was a demonstration of power. To ride out with hounds and horses, to return with venison or boar, was to remind subjects and courtiers that the king's dominion extended into the forests and fields. Yet the hunt was also deeply ritualized. The sound of horns, the careful release of falcons, the rustle of leather gloves, these details made pursuit both symbolic and soothing. Imagine the king in the saddle, the cool morning mist hanging low, his breath mingling with that of his horse as he prepared to ride into the woods. But not every monarch cared for such exertion. Some preferred the stillness of indoor pursuits. Reading, for example, was both an intellectual and personal refuge. A library filled with manuscripts was a quiet sanctuary where time seemed to slow. The feel of parchment beneath one's hand, the faint scent of ink, the play of candlelight across handwritten margins, all created a sense of intimacy and reflection. Many monarchs collected books not only as treasures, but as companions in their solitary hours. Others took to music. Courts often resounded with lutes, harpsichords, and singing voices. While professional musicians performed, some rulers enjoyed joining in. Picture a king in a richly embroidered doublet, plucking strings with more enthusiasm and skill, or a queen pressing keys upon a small keyboard, filling a chamber with gentle notes that contrasted sharply with the stern sound of politics. And then there were the collectors, monarchs who gathered curious objects from across the world. Cabinets of wonder began to appear, filled with seashells, mechanical trinkets, rare stones, and exotic animals preserved by taxidermy. These hobbies blur the line between fascination and eccentricity. To step into such a room was to step into a miniature universe, one where the strange and marvelous sat side by side. Leisure at court, then, was never entirely private. Even when a ruler embroidered or read, they were rarely alone. Attendants and courtiers lingered, observing, sometimes even participating. Privacy, as we imagine it today, scarcely existed. Instead, hobbies became shared performances, subtle decorations of taste and refinement. A king who studied astronomy might commission a new observatory. A queen who enjoyed gardens might have entire landscapes reshaped to reflect her passion. So as you imagine these palaces, do not think only of golden thrones or solemn ceremonies. Think also of music drifting down a corridor, of hunting horns echoing in distant woods, of a ruler bent over a chessboard, or gazing quietly at a shelf of books. Within these moments of stillness, we glimpse a softer dimension of monarchy, one that feels almost human, almost familiar. If we linger still longer within the palaces of Europe, we find that hobbies did not merely fill idle hours, but shaped the very rhythm of royal existence. The atmosphere of daily life was woven together from threads of ceremony, politics, and leisure, creating a pattern that repeated day after day, year after year. For a king or queen, each morning opened like a page in a well-rehearsed book. Yet between the lines of statecraft and duty, the margins were filled with curious diversions. Consider how the environment itself encouraged certain pastimes. A palace was not simply a home. It was a miniature world. Gardens stretched wide, filled with fountains, topiary, and shaded walks. Courtyards echoed with the clatter of hooves and the chatter of courtiers. Within the stone walls, chambers served different moods. Grand halls for feasting, intimate parlors for reading or embroidery, long galleries for walking in poor weather. Each space invited its own type of hobby, its own moment of stillness. The garden, for instance, was more than a place of beauty. It was a living canvas. Monarchs strolled along gravel paths, admiring the order imposed on nature, a symbol of their ability to control both land and life. Some planted rare herbs or gathered fragrant roses, enjoying the quiet work of cultivation. Others built elaborate mazes, delighting in the simple puzzle of wandering paths. Imagine a queen moving slowly through an orchard, brushing her fingers along branches heavy with fruit, pausing to inhale the scent of blossoms while attendants followed at a respectful distance. The stillness of such moments contrasted sharply with the noise of court politics. Indoors, the chamber tapestries offered its own kind of hobby. Embroidery and weaving were pastimes for noble women, but queens and princesses often took part as well. With each stitch, threads of gold or silk were worked into scenes of hunts, battles, or sacred stories. These were not idle activities. They were a way to display refinement, patience, and even piety. Imagine the hush of a chamber filled with women at work. The only sound the soft pull of thread and the distant crackle of a fire. Hours passed in rhythm, creating beauty as time slipped gently by. Kings, meanwhile, often cultivated mechanical or intellectual hobbies. Some turned to clocks and astronomy, marveling at the slow movements of stars and planets. Others played long games of chess, their minds absorbed in strategy. These pursuits offered a mirror of politics, but in miniature and without risk. A chessboard was a kingdom in wood and ivory, where losses to be reset with the sweep of a hand. Meals, too, contained elements of leisure. Feasts were ceremonial, but they also served as entertainment. Exotic food, sweet confections, and strange wines became part of a king's or queen's collection of pleasures. Yet the real delight often lay not in the eating, but in the spectacle. Pageants with sugar sculptures, fountains that seemed to pour wine, or platters arranged in shapes that told stories. Even in dining, the boundary between necessity and hobby blurred. Yet perhaps the most striking feature of royal hobbies was that they rarely occurred in solitude. A ruler's life was watched, measured, and commented upon. If a monarch preferred music, courtiers would provide instruments. If hunting was a chosen passion, nobles were summoned to ride. Even when the pastime was embroidery or reading, an audience lingered. The private hobby of a king or queen became part of the fabric of court life, shaping the culture of all who lived nearby. From dawn until dusk, the rhythm of monarchy was one of balance, labor and leisure, duty and diversion. And so, when we think of monarchs and their daily lives, it is not enough to imagine only the crown and throne. We must also imagine the moments in between. The chess game played by candlelight, the queen lingering in a perfumed garden, the quiet pulse of embroidery needles in a hushed chamber. These were the hours that gave texture to their existence, that revealed the humanity behind the majesty. As we close this first segment, hold on to the image of a palace not as a place of ceaseless ceremony, but as a tapestry woven from many threads. Some are golden, bright with politics and power. Others are softer, threads of music, gardens, games, and private wonder. Together, they formed a rhythm of daily royal life, a rhythm steady enough, gentle enough, to lull even the most restless mind toward quietude. To move from the daily lives of monarchs into the peculiar world of their hobbies, let us pause upon a single figure, one whose personal pursuits became not only a private comfort, but a matter of public fascination. Few rulers embody this mixture of grandeur and eccentricity as vividly as King Louis XVI of France. When we think of Louis XVI, it is tempting to recall him solely as the monarch whose reign collapsed in the storms of the French Revolution. Yet before those days of upheaval, Louis was, in many ways, a quiet man with quiet fascinations. While the court of Versailles glittered with pageantry, the king himself often preferred small, intricate hobbies that spoke of a mind drawn not to pomp, but to precision. Among his many interests, perhaps the most curious was his devotion to locksmithing. Yes, while he wore the crown of France, presiding over one of the most powerful nations in Europe, Louis XVI spent long hours in a workshop, fashioning locks, keys, and mechanical devices. Imagine the scene. Deep within the sprawling palace of Versailles, beyond the halls of mirrors and the painted ceilings, there lay a small, almost modest chamber. There, the king would bend over a workbench, tools spread out before him, brass fittings glinting in the lamplight. His royal hands, accustomed to seals and signatures, turned instead of files and screws, shaping pieces of metal into delicate mechanisms. This hobby was no passing fancy. Louis worked under the instruction of professional locksmith Francois Gamine, who became a regular visitor to the palace. Together they experimented with locks of increasing complexity, testing tumblers, fitting keys, and admiring the cleverness of mechanical solutions. For Louis, the satisfaction lay not in display but in the quiet click of a mechanism working perfectly, the simple triumph of function over chaos. The irony, of course, is inescapable. A king fascinated by locks would one day fail to secure his throne, undone by forces far beyond the reach of metal keys. But in his own time, this pursuit revealed a great deal about his character. Louis was methodical, cautious, and more at ease with small, concrete problems than with the vast, turbulent politics of his age. Where others saw splendor, he sought intricacy. Where courtiers longed for grand gestures, he found comfort in the tiny turn of a well-crafted key. It is easy to imagine him retreating to his workshop after a morning of councils and ceremonies. The air heavy with incense and candle wax in the great halls would give way to the simpler scent of oil and metal filings. Instead of voices raised in petition or debate, there was a soft scrape of file across brass, the gentle tap of a hammer, the quiet hum of a monarch at work. In those hours, the palace seemed to recede, and Louis was no longer the center of a kingdom, but merely a man absorbed in craft. His queen, Marie Antoinette, reportedly humored his interests but never shared them. She preferred music, theater, and the stage charms of her model village at the Petit Trianon. The contrast between them was striking. One queen play acting as a shepherdess, one king tinkering with locks. Together, they formed a portrait of royalty that seemed, in hindsight, strangely detached from the realities pressing in upon them. But Louis's locksmithing was not purely symbolic or eccentric. It also reflected the growing Enlightenment fascination with mechanics, invention, and precision. Across Europe, aristocrats and monarchs sponsored experiments in science and technology. For Louis, this was his personal contribution, a way of engaging with the spirit of the age. Yet, as history would show, the spirit of the age demanded more than private curiosity. It demanded reform and eventually revolution. Still, let us set aside for a moment the fate that awaited him. Picture instead the quiet figure of Louis XVI in a workshop, his brow bent low, his fingers careful, his tools neatly arranged. The palace around him was filled with courtiers, music, and whispers of politics. But here, in this small room, the world shrank to the precise turn of a key in its lock. In this space, the burden of kingship lifted, if only slightly, replaced by the simple, soothing rhythm of creation. And perhaps, in the strangely humble pastime, there is something deeply human. For all the distance that separated a monarch from his people, there remains a shared desire for distraction, the search for comfort in small acts of making. In the end, Louis XVI's locks were never strong enough to shield him from the storm of history. But for a time, at least, they closed the world out, leaving him with the peace of an ordinary man absorbed in an ordinary craft. The image of King Louis XVI bent over his locksmith's bench is almost startling in its simplicity. Yet to fully understand how this curious pastime fit into the life of a monarch, we must place it within the wider world of Versailles and the culture of the French court. Versailles was, in many ways, a theater of power. Every hallway, every chamber, every ritual was designed to remind courtiers and visitors of the majesty of the crown. From the famed Hall of Mirrors, with its endless reflections of gilded chandeliers, to the sprawling gardens laid out in geometric perfection, the palace proclaimed authority through spectacle. Kings and queens were not meant to be seen as ordinary men and women, but as figures apart, elevated, untouchable. Yet within this theater, Louis XVI carved out a stage of his own. His locksmith's workshop was a small, private domain, tucked away from the endless corridors of pomp. Courtiers were bemused. To them, a king filing at a piece of brass seemed almost absurd, a trivial pursuit unworthy of his station. Some mocked him quietly. Others simply shook their heads. But Louis persisted, not for their approval, but for his own quiet satisfaction. This is perhaps the heart of the story. In a world built on appearances, Louis found solace in function. A lock either worked or it did not. It could not flatter, deceive, or betray, as courtiers often did, when the tumblers fell neatly into place. When the key turned smoothly, the king achieved a certainty that politics could never provide. In these moments, Louis revealed something of his temperament. He was not a man of flamboyant gestures or fiery ambition. Instead, he was methodical, cautious, even shy. He preferred problems with solutions. Mechanical puzzles over social intrigue, gears and levers over the turbulent tides of revolution. His hobbies reflected this preference. Locks, maps, hunting equipment, globes, and tools filled his private spaces, while courtiers flocked to the Queen's theater performances and musical evenings. Marie Antoinette's world contrasted sharply with her husband's. Where Louis retreated to metal filings and keys, she sought beauty and fantasy. Her Petit Trianon estate became her refuge, where she played at being a shepherdess among artificial cottages and gardens. The two monarchs seemed, in some ways, to live parallel lives, one in a world of mechanics, the other in a world of illusions, both offering escape from the burdens of their crowns. Lewis's locksmithing, however, was more than a pastime. It also became entangled, in a small but poignant way, with the fate of the monarchy. When the revolution broke out, Lewis attempted to maintain control. Yet his very caution, his reluctance to act boldly, worked against him. In 1791, during a failed escape attempt known as a flight to Varennes, Lewis and his family were captured while trying to flee Paris. They had sought to slip away under the cover of night, but their carriage was recognized. Ironically, some of the secret compartments and mechanisms involved in his escape reflected his love of locks and hidden designs. Still, no device could protect him from the eyes of an awakened nation. Even after his capture, Lewis continued to tinker with locks. During his imprisonment in the Tuileries Palace, he requested tools and materials. There, under guard, as crowds shouted outside, he bent once more to the comfort of keys and tumblers. Imagine him seated by a small table in the dim light, the voices of revolutionaries echoing through the city, while his hands worked steadily at the tiny world of brass and steel. It was both poignant and tragic. The King of France reduced his hobby, still clinging to the certainty of mechanics while history roared around him. There is something almost dreamlike in this image. The world outside boiling with fury, the palace walls trembling with change, and within them, one solitary man, absorbed in the turning of a key. It is as if Lewis sought to lock away his fears, to shut out the noise, if only for a moment. But no lock could ever be strong enough to secure the crumbling edifice of monarchy. And yet, we should not view this hobby only through the lens of irony. It also offers a gentle reminder of the humanity of rulers. Louis XVI was not a monster tyranny, nor a caricature weakness, but a man with curiosities, anxieties, and small comforts, much like anyone else. His locksmithing was an anchor, a way to create order in a life overwhelmed by expectation. As we linger in this part of the story, picture the king once more at his bench. The palace of Versailles glitters outside. Courtiers whisper in marble halls, and yet here, in this quiet chamber, there is only the soft scrape of file, the faint glint of polished brass, and the inward satisfaction of a task completed. For a few hours, the crown can be set aside. For a few hours, the weight of France is lifted. There is only the turning of a key and the steady, soothing rhythm of craft. As Louis XVI's life moved ever closer to its tragic end, his peculiar passion for locks remained one of the more enduring curiosities of his character. In many ways, this hobby became a quiet symbol of his reign, something simultaneously gentle, thoughtful, and strangely detached from the urgent demands of his kingdom. Let us return for a moment to Versailles before the Revolution, when the palace still gleamed with its golden grandeur. In the mornings, the king performed his rituals before the watchful gaze of courtiers. He was clothed in fine garments. He ate in public. He moved through the grand chambers as though upon a stage. Yet in the evenings, he sometimes slipped away to his workshop. Imagine that scene once more. The great King of France in a modest room, bending over bits of brass and iron, the candlelight trembling on the polished metal. Courtiers might laugh, but for Louis, the space was sacred. It was a place of order, of certainty, of peace. As the revolution unfolded, Louis's locksmithing took on a new and unintended symbolism. The people of France, long accustomed to seeing their monarchs as distant figures of authority, now heard rumors of a king tinkering with locks while the nation starved. What had once been a private comfort began to sound in the echo chamber of politics, like evidence of detachment. Was this king concerned with his people, or was he absorbed in the idle pastimes of an eccentric? Of course, the truth was more complicated, yet perception often outweighed reality. One of the most telling episodes came with the discovery of the armoire de fer, the iron chest hidden within the Tuileries Palace, where Louis attempted to secure sensitive documents. The secret compartment, opened in November 1792, revealed correspondence that undermined his reputation and contributed to his downfall. The irony is heavy. A king who loved locks and secrecy places hopes in one, only for that lock to be opened by others, exposing him at the very moment when trust was most fragile. The hobby that had once soothed him now became, in the public mind, entwined with suspicion, and so the locksmith king moved toward his fate. During his trial, his calm and methodical demeanor was noted. He answered questions with care, just as he once adjusted tumblers with patience. But the great mechanism of revolution could not be stopped by careful words. The people had turned, the locks had broken, and the flood of change could no longer be contained. Even in his final days, Louis requested simple tools and small comforts. It is said he spent time in quiet reflection. His manner steady though the world around him had become chaos. One can imagine him tracing patterns on the table with his fingers, perhaps thinking of the mechanisms he once studied, the keys he once filed, the countless hours of small creation that had carried him away from the burdens of the crown. There's a strange tenderness in this memory. History often paints monarchs in broad strokes, tyrants or martyrs, heroes or villains. Yet Louis XVI was, in many ways, an ordinary man set in an extraordinary position. His locksmithing reminds us of this ordinariness. At heart, he was a man who sought comfort in craft, who found satisfaction in the quiet problem of a lock, who longed, perhaps, for a world that could be ordered and understood as neatly as the tumblers of a mechanism. His fate, of course, was far harsher. In January 1793, Louis XVI met his end upon the guillotine. The crowds roared. The age of monarchy in France seemed to crumble. But even then, chroniclers remembered the king's curious hobby. It stood as a symbol of detachment to some, of humility to others, of humanity in a man swept away by forces too vast for him to control. And so, when we think of Louis XVI, we might think not only of revolution and downfall, but also of candlelit evenings in a quiet workshop, the scrape of metal against file, the scent of oil and brass, the soft click of mechanism closing into place. These sounds and sensations tell us more about him than many of the grand speeches or decrees ever could. They reveal a man who, despite the crown upon his head, sought in his heart the same thing we all do, a moment of peace, a sense of order, a hobby that made the world feel a little more secure. As we leave his story behind, let that image linger, not the tumults of crowds or the thunder of revolution, but the quiet, steady figure of a king at his bench. His tools neatly arranged, his focus unwavering, his satisfaction found not in conquest, but in the turning of a key. In that simplicity lies the paradox of his reign, and perhaps its tragedy. A man better suited to locksmithing than kingship, to quiet craft than to the storms of history. When we step back from the biographies of particular monarchs and instead look at the wider traces left behind in history, a different kind of story begins to unfold. It is a story told not through personal memories, but through artifacts, manuscripts, and strange little details that survive in archives and archaeological sites. Among these fragments, we sometimes discover hints of the unusual hobbies of European rulers, pursuits that seem almost whimsical when compared to the gravity of their crowns. Consider, for instance, the curious collections that monarchs assembled across Europe, beginning in the late Middle Ages and reaching their height in the Renaissance. Kings and queens established what came to be called cabinets of curiosities, small rooms or elaborate chambers filled with strange objects. To a modern visitor, such collections might look like a mixture of a museum, a toy chest, and a magician's workshop. Seashells from distant lands sat beside fossils, minerals, globes, preserved animals, and mechanical devices. One might ask, were these collections a hobby or a demonstration of power? In truth, they were both. For rulers, gathering objects from across the globe was a way of asserting dominion over knowledge itself. But there's also a sense of play here, a delight in strangeness. Archaeologists and historians who have studied these cabinets describe them as spaces of wonder, rooms designed to astonish, but also to comfort. Imagine a king wandering through shelves of objects on a quiet evening, running his hand along the smooth curve of a nautilus shell, marveling at the intricacies of nature, and perhaps feeling, for a moment, a childlike fascination. These collections sometimes took on peculiar forms. The Habsburg Emperor Rudolph II, for example, filled his palace in Prague with objects so bizarre and numerous that visitors compared it to a world in miniature. He owned clocks that displayed the movement of planets, portraits made of vegetables and fruit, alchemical instruments, and even relics that blurred the line between natural history and myth. To walk through his halls was to wander into a dreamlike universe where science, superstition, and art collided. Archaeological evidence of these hobbies often appears in unexpected ways. Inventories survive, listing objects once stored in palaces. Painted illustrations show rulers proudly displaying a favorite oddity. Excavations at former royal residences sometimes uncover fragments, a broken piece of celestial globe, or the remnants of imported coral used as decoration. Each fragment whispers of a ruler who took delight in the unusual. Even gardens, those carefully cultivated landscapes around palaces, reveal themselves as archaeological records of hobby. Beneath layers of earth, researchers find the outlines of mazes, fountains, and artificial grottos once used by monarchs for entertainment. These were not merely symbols of control over nature, but playgrounds on a grand scale. In the 17th century, for example, European rulers created elaborate water gardens, filled with hidden fountains designed to spray unsuspecting guests. To us, such amusements might seem childish, but to the monarchs of the past, they offered laughter, surprise, and a break from the seriousness of rule. There is also a lingering mystery in the hobbies of monarchs. Some pastimes are only dimly remembered, their full meaning lost. Chronicles occasionally mention kings who dabbled in astrology, queens who kept unusual pets, or rulers who played peculiar board games now forgotten. We see the traces, the cardboard scratched into stone, the references and letters to an odd obsession, but the rules, the feelings, the reasons are gone. What remains is a faint echo, tantalizing and incomplete. And so, history leaves us with glimpses. A dusty lock once turned in a king's hand, a fossil admired by a queen, now labeled in a museum case, a tangle of hedges that once formed a maze, their outlines barely visible in aerial photographs of the land. These fragments remind us that monarchy was not only about politics and power, but also about curiosity, about the ways rulers sought to amuse themselves when the crown grew heavy. As you picture these remnants, imagine yourself wandering slowly through such a space. The room is dim, lit by flickering lamps. On one shelf rests a collection of seashells, each more elaborate than the last. On another sits a mechanical bird that, when wooed, flaps its wings. There is a faint scent of varnished wood, of parchment and oil. Outside, the palace hums with ceremony. But here, in this chamber, time feels suspended. It is a timeless atmosphere of hobby, a universal human impulse to gather, to tinker, to play. This is a mystery of royal hobbies. They remind us that kings and queens were not only rulers, but also collectors, dreamers, and players in their own private worlds. And though centuries have passed, their curiosities still linger, in artifacts, in manuscripts, in fragments buried beneath the soil, waiting for us to stumble upon them, to puzzle over them, and to imagine the joy they once brought to royal hands. If we linger still within the realm of cultural hobbies, we find that many monarchs express their curiosity not only through objects and gardens, but through music, performance, and the written word. Archaeological remains and manuscript evidence alike suggest that the love of sound and story was as deeply ingrained in royal pastime as it was in ordinary folk traditions. Yet the hobbies of kings and queens in this domain often left mysterious traces, fragments that make us wonder about evenings long forgotten. Imagine for a moment a royal court in the 15th or 16th century, beyond the feasts and ceremonies, beyond the heavy discussions of diplomacy and war. There were evenings where monarchs entertained themselves with music. Some rulers were accomplished players themselves. Others preferred to surround themselves with virtuosos, not only to be entertained, but to learn, to experiment, and even participate in music making as a form of recreation. Archaeologists and historians sometimes stumble upon unusual instruments preserved in storerooms or depicted in paintings commissioned by monarchs. In Prague, for example, researchers have studied remnants of rare keyboard instruments once housed in Rudolf II's collections, devices with unusual tuning systems that suggest a ruler fascinated not only by melody, but by the mathematics of harmony. Elsewhere, courts preserve strange hybrid instruments, viols merged with harps, lutes with carved embellishments so elaborate they seem less like tools for music and more like works of sculpture. To modern ears and eyes, these may seem impractical, but they tell us of a time when musical hobby was both experimentation and display. Some monarchs turned their attention to writing, not merely as a means of recording law or statecraft, but as a personal pastime. Medieval and Renaissance manuscripts preserve the poems of kings and queens, verses scribbled in margins, or complete collections penned during periods of quiet. These writings are often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, yet they give us glimpses of rulers at leisure, grappling with emotions or indulging in allegorical play. Archaeologists of the written word, philologists and paleographers, treat these manuscripts like material relics, carefully deciphering handwriting, tracing inks, and reconstructing lost hobbies of the mind. And then there is theater, a passion that repeatedly drew royal attention. Monarchs across Europe commissioned performances not only for their courts, but sometimes for their own personal involvement. Some dressed in costume and performed alongside courtiers, taking on roles in allegorical plays or masks. The archaeological remnants of such amusements are subtle. The foundations of temporary stages uncovered in palace courtyards, the faded scripts stored in dusty archives, the surviving costumes embroidered with gold thread. Each clue suggests evenings where kings and queens delighted in make-believe, stepping momentarily away from their titles to inhabit mythological figures, shepherds, or gods. These pursuits blur the line between ruler and artist. They remind us that even within the most formal of environments, the throne room, the council chamber, the great hall, there was room for play. Yet the mystery lies in the silence between the fragments. What did it feel like to hear a king pluck a string on a lute late at night? What emotion stirred as a queen recited a poem in her private chamber? Words meant for no audience but herself. These questions remain unanswered, shadows of moments that resist full recovery. The archaeology of sound and performance is particularly elusive. Unlike stone, wood, or metal, music vanishes into the air. What survives are the instruments, the notation, the depictions. When archaeologists excavate palace sites, they sometimes find delicate fragments, bone pipes, scraps of parchment with notations, or brass fittings from instruments now long gone. To piece these together is to attempt to resurrect hobbies that once filled chambers with sound, laughter, and rhythm. Picture yourself in such a setting. The hall is dimly lit, perhaps by candles placed in ornate holders. Courtiers sit quietly, waiting. A monarch takes up an instrument, perhaps awkwardly, perhaps with skill, and the first notes drift into the stillness. The sound is faint but persistent, echoing off stone walls. It is not the performance of a professional musician, but the hobby of a ruler seeking joy, distraction, or solace. Centuries later, we stand at a distance, holding only the remains. A score copied in ink, an instrument cracked with age, a costume preserved in fragments. The mystery of these hobbies lies not only in what we know, but in what we can only imagine. Did monarchs find peace in music? Did poetry ease the loneliness of rule? Did theater allow them to escape, if only briefly, the burdens of power? These are questions without definitive answers, but they invite us to view rulers not as distant, rigid figures, but as human beings drawn to art, sound, and performance as sources of comfort. In this way, the archaeology of cultural hobby making is less about tangible remains and more about atmosphere. It is about conjuring the sense of a lute's resonance, the flicker of candlelight on painted scenery, the texture of parchment beneath a monarch's hand. It is about allowing imagination to fill the spaces where history falls silent, recognizing that the desire to create, to perform, and to lose oneself in beauty is as old as monarchy itself. If we step away from music, poetry, and theater, we find yet another mysterious layer of hobbies among European monarchs, those that lean toward the intellectual and the esoteric. For rulers, curiosity did not always find its outlet in gardens or banquets. Instead, it often took the form of collections of rare books, the study of astrology, or even experiments in what we might now call the natural sciences. These hobbies leave behind a rich archaeological and documentary trail, though always fragmented, always elusive, much like the scattered pieces of a puzzle that will never be fully complete. Take, for example, the libraries assembled by monarchs. To collect books was more than a statement of wealth. It was a pastime that suggested both curiosity and prestige. Vast collections were accumulated in royal palaces, some of which survive today, though rarely intact. Manuscripts illuminated with gold, early printed books bound in leather, scientific treatises imported from distant lands, all became part of the king or queen's private hours of study. The archaeology of these libraries is not about excavation in soil, but about uncovering catalogs, deciphering ex libris marks, and reconstructing which volumes once sat on those shelves. In doing so, historians begin to see how rulers treated reading not merely as duty, but as hobby, sitting in quiet chambers, turning parchment pages by candlelight. Some monarchs were drawn to astrology, a pursuit that combined wonder, mathematics, and the need for guidance. Court astrologers often prepared charts, yet there were kings and queens who took the time to study the heavens themselves. Imagine a monarch at night, stepping onto a balcony, peering upward at the stars. They may have traced constellations, whispered questions about fate, or sketched planetary alignments in notebooks. Archaeological remnants of such hobbies survive in star charts, astrolabes, and treatises annotated in royal hands. To modern readers, these may feel like curiosities, but for monarchs, the hobby of astrology was both entertainment and reassurance, a way to explore the mysteries of destiny. Others indulge in what we would now describe as the natural sciences. Monarchs collected shells, stones, dried plants, or preserved animals, fascinated by the patterns of the natural world. These cabinets of curiosity were partly displays of power, but they were also expressions of hobbyist wonder. To walk into such a room, lined with shelves, filled with labeled specimens, jars of liquid, dried leaves pressed into volumes, was to step into personal amusement of a ruler who sought knowledge through objects. Archaeologists today sometimes find traces of these collections, the remains of cabinets, the bones of animals brought from afar, or early catalogs scribbled in fading ink. They reveal monarchs who were not content to leave exploration scholars, but engaged in their own private investigations. The mystery deepens when we consider how ephemeral many of these hobbies were. Unlike monuments or palaces, hobbies often leave only fragile traces. A pressed flower crumbles, a notebook is lost, a telescope breaks. Yet every so often, discoveries surprise us. A forgotten drawer in a palace may contain seashells brought back from voyages. A cracked astrolabe may resurface in an excavation. A half-erased sketch of a comet may appear in the margins of a royal manuscript. These fragments remind us that behind the weight of rulership, there were moments of quiet fascination, of rulers who collected not only lands but also fragments of knowledge. There's also a more hidden side to these hobbies, an interest in the mystical or the arcane. Some monarchs practice forms of alchemy, not only as political tools, but as private fascination. They experimented with metals, strange powders, and recipes that promise transformation. Archaeologists sometimes find alchemical furnaces in palace cellars, or manuscripts filled with coded symbols. To us, these may seem like odd hobbies, yet they reveal rulers deeply curious about mysteries that blended science, spirituality, and imagination. The tone of these pursuits is different from the noisy halls of music or the lively gatherings of theater. These were hobbies of solitude, of quiet contemplation. Imagine the hush of a library, the smell of parchment and wax, the scratch of a quill. Picture a monarch leaning over a celestial globe, tracing stars with a fingertip, or envision a king lifting a small seashell, marveling at its spiral form, wondering at the mysteries of the ocean. These images linger, faint yet evocative, hinting at the inner worlds of rulers we so often imagine only in armor or robes of state. For us today, the archaeological recovery of these hobbies is less about complete stories and more about impressions. Each fragment, each surviving object, is like a note in a melody. Alone it is incomplete, but together they suggest an atmosphere, a rhythm, a habit of mind. When pieced together, they remind us that monarchs, like us, sought meaning and diversion in quiet fascinations. They reveal the human need to turn away from daily burdens and immerse in something mysterious, whether that be the stars, the secrets of books, or the hidden patterns of nature. And so, in this segment of our journey, we see that the hobbies of monarchs were not only about outward display, but also about inward wonder. They studied the heavens, collected curiosities, and experimented with transformations. Much of it is lost, dissolved into time. Yet enough remains to let us imagine. Kings and queens in dimly lit rooms, surrounded by books, shells, charts, and strange apparatus, quietly exploring mysteries not of kingdoms, but the world itself. When we picture European monarchs and their unusual hobbies, it is easy to imagine them as solitary figures, lost in music, quietly observing the stars, or tending a hidden menagerie. Yet to truly understand these pastimes, we must place them within the broader fabric of royal society. Kings and queens did not live in isolation. Their lives were performed on a stage where courtiers, noble families, attendants, and foreign visitors constantly observed their every action. A monarch's hobbies, no matter how personal, always resonated within the social world of their time. Some were admired, others ridiculed, and still others became fashions that swept through entire courts. Consider the elaborate tapestry of daily life in a royal palace. From dawn until late night, monarchs were rarely alone. Attendants were present to assist in dressing. Officials arrived to discuss matters of governance, and noble visitors filled great halls with ceremony. Into this constant flow of activity, the rulers' hobbies wove themselves in curious ways. A king who spent hours in a library might be whispered about by courtiers as overly studious. A queen who delighted in animal companions might inspire her ladies-in-waiting to keep pets of their own. A monarch who tinkered with alchemical experiments in a side chamber might be viewed with fascination or unease. The social dynamics of these hobbies reveal a contrast between ruler and ruled. For ordinary subjects, time for leisure was scarce. Most people worked long hours in fields, workshops, or markets, their days shaped by necessity rather than amusement. In contrast, monarchs, though burdened by the weight of power, possessed both the means and protection to indulge in curiosities. This created a striking imbalance. The peasants who strained to provide food for the realm likely never saw the king's pet giraffe, or heard the queen's private lute performance, or glanced at the astrologer's charts made for royal eyes. The hobbies of rulers, then highlight not only their individuality, but also the gulf between elite and common life. This gulf could take humorous forms. Imagine a farmer trudging through mud to plant crops while a monarch, not far away, was preoccupied with breeding exotic songbirds or writing verses about the changing seasons. Both were immersed in rhythms of life, yet one was bound by survival, while the other explored leisure and learning. From a distance of centuries, these contrasts feel almost absurd, but they remind us of the very different worlds that existed side by side within the same kingdom. Hobbies also acted as signals within the hierarchy of court society. When a king cultivated a passion for chess, courtiers hurried to play along, presenting ornate chessboards as gifts. When a queen adored embroidery, noble women sought to outdo each other with patterns of silk and gold. In this way, a monarch's private amusement became a public fashion, rippling outward to the elite, often leaving behind artifacts that survive today. Jeweled gaming pieces, intricate tapestries, or furniture carved to reflect royal tastes. Of course, not every hobby was admired. Some inspired quiet mockery. A monarch who devoted excessive time to theatrical performances, dressing in costumes and acting on stage, might be whispered about behind fans and tapestries. A ruler obsessed with hunting might be seen as neglecting affairs of state. Rumors circulated quickly in palaces, carried by servants and courtiers eager to interpret every royal act. To study these social reactions is to glimpse how the seemingly private world of hobbies was never entirely private at all. We also find moments when hobbies bridge the divide between monarch and subject. A royal garden, for example, could become a place where commoners were occasionally admitted to stroll and admire the blooms. Festivals where the king performed music or the queen composed verse allowed glimpses of rulers not only as sovereigns, but as human beings. In such moments, hobbies soften the distance between palace and town, even if only temporarily. For subjects, seeing a monarch sing, paint, or experiment with strange curiosities must have felt both surprising and oddly reassuring, as though behind the crown there lingered a mind not wholly unlike their own. There's an irony in all this. Hobbies, by their nature, seem personal and intimate, yet in royal life they became instruments of image and influence. A king's fascination with astronomy might encourage others to view him as wise. A queen's love for painting might present her as cultured. A ruler's devotion to hunting could signal vigor and authority, whether they intended it or not. Monarchs shaped how they were perceived through the quiet rituals of their leisure. And so, in examining hobbies not simply as curiosities, but as social phenomena, we glimpse the larger theater of monarchy. Each pursuit, no matter how odd or whimsical, became entangled with the structures of court life, the whispers of the elite, and the silent gaze of common subjects. These contrasts between public and private, elite and ordinary, give depth to our understanding of the royal pastimes that might otherwise seem trivial. Imagine, then, standing in a great hall, torches flickering, courtiers gathered in clusters, servants moving quietly in the background. At the center of it all sits the monarch, perhaps idly turning a page of a book, or adjusting the strings of a lute, or gently petting a small exotic animal perched beside the throne. Around them ripple reactions, admiration, envy, quiet laughter. Beyond the palace walls, fields stretch into the distance where peasants labor in the fading light. Two worlds, vastly different, yet bound together by the same realm. In this first glimpse of the social dimension of hobbies, we see how they both defined and divided royal life. They were not mere amusements, but symbols, sometimes admired, sometimes mocked, often imitated, always noticed. And through these contrasts, the rhythm of past centuries comes into view, rulers indulging curiosities under gilded ceilings, while ordinary men and women labor beneath open skies. When we move deeper into the social fabric of royal courts, the hobbies of monarchs appear not just as curiosities, but as threads that shaped etiquette, politics, and even diplomacy. A king's delight in falconry, for instance, was not merely about the thrill of the hunt. It was also a stage upon which noble families vied for his attention, offering the finest birds or demonstrating skill in handling them. What might seem like leisure was, in fact, another arena of influence, court gathering where falcons perched proudly on gloved hands, feathers shimmering in the morning light. The monarch steps forward, his bird poised and restless. When released, the falcon arcs across the sky, watched by dozens of eyes. Some see sport, others see symbolism. The king's control over a creature of the air becomes a subtle metaphor for his control over the realm. Courtiers murmur, eager to associate themselves with his passion. For some, supplying a royal aviary was a way to curry favor. For others, joining the pastime was a chance to stand close to the sovereign, to be seen as part of his intimate circle. Hobbies could also become avenues of rivalry among the elite. If the queen adored poetry, ambitious nobles sought to present verses of their own, flattering yet artful. If a king pursued architecture, noble patrons commissioned grand buildings to demonstrate their shared taste. In this way, personal hobbies radiated outward, shaping the broader culture of the court. A single royal preference might set trends for decades. One can imagine how courtiers scrambled to show knowledge of astronomy when a monarch became fascinated with the stars, or how they suddenly claimed interest in gardening if the queen walked daily among her roses. For common people, however, such interests often remained distant whispers. They heard of them through stories, gossip, or the occasional glimpse of a procession. The contrast was stark. While a ruler might pass time debating the virtues of Italian versus Flemish painting styles, a farmer's concerns were rooted in the fertility of the soil or the price of grain at market. These parallel worlds highlight the uneven distribution of leisure. Time itself was a privilege, and hobbies became emblems of that privilege. Yet, in a curious way, monarchs sometimes drew their subjects into these pursuits. Festivals and ceremonies often echoed the private amusements of rulers. If a king loved pageantry, entire cities might be decorated for his entrances, with plays, songs, and tableaus echoing his tastes. If a queen adored gardens, townsfolk might be invited, on rare occasions, to stroll in specially prepared parterres, marveling at flowers imported from distant lands. For ordinary people, these glimpses were fleeting but memorable. They reinforced the distance between sovereign and subject, while also weaving them into a shared cultural moment. Another dimension was the way foreign visitors perceived these hobbies. Ambassadors reported them in letters, often with fascination or bemusement. A monarch's devotion to clockmaking, for instance, might be praised as a sign of intellect in one court, while mocked as eccentricity in another. Such observations mattered, for royal reputation was a currency in the delicate balance of European politics. Hobbies were not entirely innocent diversions. They contributed, in subtle ways, to how rulers were judged beyond their borders. Of course, behind the polish of court life lay quiet tensions. Some monarchs were criticized for allowing leisure to overshadow governance. A king who spent long hours composing music might be whispered about as neglectful of his counsel. A queen who lingered in gardens might be portrayed as frivolous. The court was quick to interpret every action, and hobbies became another language in which reputation was written. It was a precarious balance. To indulge too much risked seeming idle. To ignore such pursuits risked seeming joyless or severe. This tension can be imagined in the grand halls of Renaissance Europe, where every gesture of the monarch was scrutinized. A ruler lifting a paintbrush or adjusting a telescope might not have thought of politics in that moment. But those who observed them did. Courtiers, rivals, and foreign eyes drew conclusions, spinning meaning from simple acts of curiosity. Thus, even the quietest pastimes, scribbling notes in the margins of book, training a falcon, strumming a lute, became part of the vast performance of monarchy. And yet, There is something deeply human in these stories. Beneath the layers of symbolism, power, and hierarchy, hobbies reveal monarchs as people. Curious, restless, yearning for beauty or distraction. A king fascinated by horology was not only reinforcing his image as a thoughtful ruler, but also soothing his own mind by listening to the measured tick of gears. A queen who painted flowers was not solely crafting an image of refinement, but also lingering in the calm repetition of brush against parchment. These moments, however entangled with social meaning, still carried the gentle rhythms of human leisure. In this way, monarchs and their subjects, though divided by status, shared something universal. All people, no matter their rank, have sought small escapes from duty. For peasants, it might have been a song sung during work or a stolen moment of laughter in the fields. For rulers, it took the form of more extravagant pastimes. The scale differed, the surroundings differed, but the impulse was the same: to step briefly outside the demands of life and dwell in something lighter, more personal, more sustaining. As we listen to these echoes, the contrast between elite hobbies and common existence becomes clearer. And yet, instead of hardening the divide, these stories allow us to see the common thread of human nature running through palace and village alike. Leisure, curiosity, the desire for moments of beauty. These are not merely trappings of royalty, but part of what it has meant across time to be human. The stories of royal hobbies, scattered across centuries, invite us to consider how leisure and identity intertwine in the great palaces of Europe. What may seem at first glance like simple distractions, hunting, painting, music making, or collecting, often carried layered meanings. To stroll through a king's garden, filled with rare blossoms imported from distant ports, was not only to encounter beauty, but also to witness a declaration of global influence. Each bloom was a quiet proclamation: here is the reach of my ships, my merchants, my ambassadors. In this way, a monarch's pastime was rarely isolated from the machinery of governance. A passion for horology, the making and collecting of clocks, might seem purely intellectual, yet it also spoke to a ruler's vision of order, precision, and mastery of time itself. A sovereign absorbed in astronomy was not only gazing at the heavens, but also aligning himself with the authority of celestial patterns, suggesting that his reign was written among the stars. Even a fondness for the theater, seemingly a diversion, became a stage upon which the legitimacy of rule was rehearsed and reinforced. Still, the gentle rhythms of these hobbies were deeply personal. Imagine the quiet chamber of a queen, its windows curtained against the chill of a northern evening. She bends over parchment, sketching the delicate lines of flower, her brush dipping into pigments carefully prepared by attendants. In that moment, surrounded by silence, she is less a monarch than an artist absorbed in her craft. The world of politics and ceremony remains outside the door, and within the chamber there's only the slow, calming repetition of paint meeting paper. For her, as for anyone, such moments of immersion must have offered rest from the relentless demands of life. Across the centuries, this desire for reprieve is constant. A medieval king might have found it in falconry, a Renaissance prince in the study of ancient manuscripts, a Baroque ruler in elaborate court masks. The forms change, but the impulse remained the same. Leisure served as both escape and expression, an escape from duty and an expression of identity. One can almost trace the rhythm of reigns through these diversions, as if the texture of a monarch's rule was embroidered not only in treaties and battles, but also in the softer threads of pastime. What did these hobbies mean for those who observed them? Courtiers read them as signs, diplomats as clues, common folk as distant curiosities. A monarch's pastime was never only private. It was part of the performance of sovereignty. And yet, beneath the layers of interpretation, there was the simple truth of a human being seeking meaning and rhythm in their days. This duality, public symbolism and private solace, makes royal hobbies especially revealing. They are windows into both the machinery of power and the quiet heart of those who wielded it. The contrast of the lives of common people, however, must not be overlooked. While rulers sketch gardens or tune harpsichords, their subjects labor from dawn to dusk, with leisure measured in minutes rather than hours. A peasant's pastime might be a song sung during work, a game played with children, or a tale told by the fire after supper. For them, leisure was fleeting and fragile, often overshadowed by survival. Yet the human impulse was the same: to find beauty, to create rhythm, to dwell briefly in something lighter. It is striking, then, how history's great divide between palace and village narrows when seen through the lens of pastime. The scale and setting differed, but the essence endured. A king falconing in the fields, a queen sketching a lily, a farmer humming in the furrows. All were seeking a moment of ease, a pause in the current of labor and duty. The shared humanity of these moments echoes across time, softening the boundaries of class and power. When we consider European monarchs in this way, they cease to be distant figures of ceremony and become individuals, shaped not only by the weight of crowns, but also by the lighter touches of curiosity. Their hobbies remind us that history is not only a chronicle of wars and decrees, but also a tapestry of quieter rhythms. Birds in flight, brushes on parchment, strings plucked in candlelight. To remember these moments is to remember that rulers, too, were human, their lives woven from the same threads of rest, desire, and imagination that continue to shape our own. As the night deepens, you might imagine yourself wandering through these courts, not as a courtier or a monarch, but as a quiet observer, moving unnoticed among the chambers and gardens. You would see the falcons waiting in their mews, the paintings drying in hidden studios, the instruments resting on velvet cushions. You would sense the contrasts, the grandeur and the intimacy, the formality of power and the vulnerability of private joy. And as you passed through, you would feel the continuity of human longing across centuries, whispering softly from every corner of the palace. In this final reflection, the hobbies of monarchs become more than curiosities. They become a reminder that even at the summit of power, the need for leisure, beauty, and rhythm was inescapable. It is a truth that connects palaces and villages, past and present, history, and the quiet of this very night. As you listen, perhaps drifting into dreams, you may carry with you this thought: that the stories of royal pastimes are not only about kings and queens, but about the enduring human search for small sanctuaries of peace amid the burdens of life. And so, dear listener, we have wandered together through the curious world of monarchs and their pastimes. From gardens where rare blossoms whispered of distant voyages, to quiet chambers where brushes met parchment, from stables filled with prized horses to music echoing through candlelit halls, the lives of kings and queens reveal themselves in softer hues. Their reigns, so often remembered for battles, decrees, and ceremonies, were also shaped by gentler rhythms. Their hobbies, their fascinations, their moments of stillness. If you reflect upon these stories, you may find that the centuries grow less distant. A queen painting petals in silence does not feel so far from a person today sketching in a notebook. A king gazing through a telescope is not so different from someone now looking up at the night sky from a balcony or garden. The settings may have been grand, yet the longing was familiar. To pause, to imagine, to dwell for a while in something lighter than duty. In this way, history soothes rather than startles. It reminds us that even among palaces and crowns, the search for comfort and beauty was as essential as it is for you now. Lying back, listening to these stories in the quiet of the evening. The world outside continues with all its bustle and demands. But here, in this space of calm narration, you are invited to rest. Perhaps you are already drifting, your thoughts meandering like a river through landscapes of memory and dream. If so, allow yourself to surrender fully to that current. And if you remain awake, know that the steady pace of these old stories will continue to carry you gently, without urgency, without insistence, until sleep finds you naturally. This is what we do together on Sleepy Historian. We take the past, with all its grandeur and weight, and render it soft enough to cradle you toward rest. If you found this journey through boring history for sleep, through bedtime relaxation and calm storytelling, soothing in its own quiet way, you might choose to support it, only if it truly helps you. Feel free to like the video, subscribe, and share it with others who may need the same stillness. And perhaps, if you wish, you can leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time of night or early morning it is for you. There is something strangely comforting in knowing who else is out there across the world, listening to the same stories as they drift into slumber. So now, dim the lights a little further. Let the room grow quiet. Let your breathing settle into an easy rhythm. Allow the weight of the day to fall away, as kings and queens, gardens and falcons, telescopes and paintings dissolve into the soft haze of sleep. The past has offered its gentle company, and the present offers you rest. Good night, and may peace linger with you as you dream.